It is on. Good afternoon. Welcome to Cranbrook Art Museum. I'm Andrew Blavel, the director. I'm glad you were able to join us this afternoon for what I think will be a really great conversation. I had a sneak preview of a part of it when I was out at Portland to see the debut of the exhibition In the Vanguard on the Haystack School of Crafts. So I should probably try to tie the knot. So we're actually opening 3 exhibitions today. One on Ruth Adler-Schnee, who's a graduate of Cranbrook Academy of Art from the class of 1946, still with us at age 96, still designing textiles is her métier. And then we're also opening a show on the work of Christy Matson, some new pieces, exhibition called Crossings. And then this exhibition, which there is a lovely catalog, In the Vanguard, Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, 1950 to 1969. And so we're pleased to have with us this afternoon the curators of that exhibition and the executive director of the current Haystack. And someone asked me, is it still there? And I'm like, yes, very much so, and very, very active. That's the problem when you do these historical shows. It sounds like it's birth and death dates or something. So very much alive and very active. So Paul is able to join us, and we're grateful for that. So this afternoon we'll be hearing from Rachael Arauz, who's an art historian, independent curator. Her curatorial projects prior to In the Vanguard include Keith Haring, Journey of the Radiant Baby for the Reading Public Museum, and The Shape of Abstraction for the Boston University Art Gallery, among others. She holds her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Joining Rachael is Diana Greenwold, who is the Associate Curator of American Art at the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine. She's currently working on Myth Makers, The Art of Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington, to be on view at the museum there, as well as at Denver Art Museum and the Ellen Carter Museum of American Art in 2020 through 2021. She has held past roles at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and holds her PhD in art history from the University of California at Berkeley. And last but certainly not least, we're thrilled to have Paul Sacaridiz, Executive Director of Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. Paul has over 16 years' experience in higher education. Prior to leading Haystack, he served as professor and chair of the Department of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Paul has been a fellow with the National Council of Arts Administrators and has served on the boards of the National Council on Education for Ceramic Arts and the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. His work as an artist has been included in exhibitions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Denver Art Museum, and the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, among many others. Please join me in helping welcome these 3 speakers.
Well, thank you all so much for having us. We are thrilled to be here. I want to give everyone an out at this juncture. If you're here for these haystacks, you are in the wrong spot. This is maybe more applicable. This was a great joke at my institution, at a place that values and understands craft at a much deeper level. You all probably knew what you were getting into. We are really, really excited to be here. I wanted to begin by thanking our funders for the exhibition, particularly the NEH, as well as the whole team at Haystack, Paul, Ellen, Ginger, Candy, and Jean, who were so pivotal throughout the entire process of pulling this exhibition together. I want to recognize also the members of the family of Mary Beeson Bishop, Haystack's primary first benefactor, who were available and with us for some portion of this weekend's festivities, as well as Ken Gross and Gerhard Nodell, who have so warmly welcomed us to the neighborhood, and we're so pleased for their generosity. And thank you also so much to the Cranbrook Art Museum staff who've brought this exhibition from Portland here and installed it so nicely. Thank you to Andrew, to Sarah Doty, and to John Geiger for having us and for putting the show up. So I'll just say briefly that what we're going to do is Rachael and I are going to talk a little bit about how the project came together and some of our most exciting research finds. Rachael and I started the project around 5 years ago, which was pretty much the time that Paul started as the new director at Haystacks. So I think in a lot of wonderful ways, we were all making exciting discoveries about Haystacks' first 2 decades together in a way that really sort of grew, I think, on each other's interests and passions. So it's lovely to be here, both with Rachael and with Paul. And I did also want to mention just briefly, Rachael said just as we were starting, she said, "This is the last rodeo, Diana." So I do just want to say too that I could not have asked for a more dedicated or brilliant colleague for this. So I'm very grateful, Rachael, that we were able to do this together.
It was a team effort.
It very much was. So Haystack was founded in 1950 and ran, the exhibition traces its first 2 decades through 1969. And I think Rachael and I had both heard of Haystack as an important school in the context of craft, but what we discovered throughout the process of this exhibition was that in fact this was an institution that from its founding moment in 1950 came to have a really vital importance to the history of American modernism. And that in particular, Haystack's first director, Fran Merritt, understood a really encapsulating and capacious way to see art and craft in tandem and way to understand modernism as inclusive of many different strains that could come together and influence and interact with one another. So what you're seeing here is just one instantiation of that. This is the exhibition that Merritt and his wife Priscilla put together at Centennial House, which was one of Haystack's exhibition spaces and gallery spaces. And you see here work by glass artist Michael Boylan, hand in hand with Franz Wildenhain Potts, Cranbrook alums featured here with Stefan Davidek with his print work, and then Jack Leonard Larson textiles. So just one instance in which you really see that fluidity coming into play in a really natural way with Haystack. Haystack was in 2 different locations. In both locations, it was a small and kind of deliberately rural space, but was deeply connected to urban networks and indeed to craft schools and larger art institutions across the country. So in researching Haystack, we began to unearth connections between places like Black Mountain, like Penland, but also importantly places like Cranbrook. So the fact that the show is here is entirely fitting, both because Mary Beeson Bishop, the benefactor, came from Flint and brought Fran Merritt from this region, but also because so many of the early teachers who came to Haystack, folks like Jack Leonard Larson, were Cranbrook alums, and I think very much borrowed a lot of the ethos from their time here and brought that to time and experience at Haystack. Some of the really kind of important takeaways I think that we got from looking carefully at the artists who were there and at the way that Haystack emerged was that community was an extremely important thing for these artists and continues to be really at Haystack, that summer after summer community is made and remade because there's no permanent faculty, but that working together, that working between studios and media is something that was vital to the types of work and the types of experimentation and process-oriented learning that happened during that time. And also that environment was really, really important to the experience of artists at Haystack, both that inland space where they began and then its beautiful current oceanside setting in Deer Isle, Maine, where Haystack is today. It's a place that to this day, I think, the perceived hierarchies between art and craft are productively dismantled, and in a place really that as we discovered, has an important spot in understanding a new mode of thinking about modernism.
Okay, make sure this is working. Yes? Is it working now? Yes, okay. So, hi everyone. As Diana just alluded to, Haystack's early history includes the story of 2 campuses. And in defining the chronological parameters for the exhibition, we decided to settle on the story of the school's first 2 decades, which allowed us to tell the little-known story of Haystack's founding and first campus in the town of Montville with a postal address in Liberty, so it became known as the Liberty Campus. As well as its move in 1961 to the iconic campus in Deer Isle, Maine, for which it has become quite famous as an architectural landmark. 1969 was also a really landmark year in craft history, so that also helped inform our decision to end the study of the school's history in 1969. Not only is 1969 the year that the important internationally touring exhibition Objects USA happens, which really defines the studio craft movement for a generation. But in 1969, Haystack also took a really substantial retrospective look at its own first 20 years with a major exhibition at the Flint Institute of Art in honor of the school's patron, Mary Beeson Bishop. So it was interesting to discover there are quite a few artists who are in both shows, both in Haystack's little mini retrospective in 1969 at the Flint show, as well as in the internationally traveling exhibition, Objects USA. So that was how we settled on 1969 as that important end date and that beautiful roundness of 2 decades and 2 campuses. The original campus, you see a photo on the left of everyone in the Haystack Lodge, which was also the dining hall. The original campus was hastily designed and built in just a few months. The school's founded in late December 1950. They hastily pulled the campus together in the spring of 1951, and you can imagine in rural Maine, it can't happen too early in the spring. They have to wait till the snow melts. It's designed and built by Edgar Sewell and the small group of Maine craftspeople who founded the school. The campus was adjacent to the Sewell's home, where he and his wife Marjorie and their friend Potter Elizabeth Crawford had sought to create a lifestyle grounded in art and nature. And they're very much of a sort of back to the land mentality about how craft will help you live a fulfilling life. Making art and being creative within the context of the natural world was at the heart of Haystack's origins. In 1957, they discovered that a main highway project is going to pretty much ruin the original campus, and they find this beautiful piece of property in Deer Isle, Maine, where no highway will ever go through it ever again. And in the moving of the new location, they hire architect Edward Larrabee Barnes to design what would become an award-winning campus of spare, mid-century forms, and again, the natural setting is fundamental to the school's identity. You'll see upstairs in the exhibition a variety of works of art from both decades where artists were really responding to the experience of being in that beautiful natural landscape. I think for everyone who's ever been to Haystack, that combination of sea and pines and rocks and moss is really one of the defining elements of what it means to be at Haystack. And that was true at the old campus and certainly is a dynamic and memorable part of being at the current Deer Isle campus. Okay, so we knew Haystack was a really important, legendary place for craft education. But we kind of thought there would be some secondary literature, and it was pretty surprising to realize there was absolutely no secondary literature on Haystack's history, and even many of the iconic makers who'd spent time at Haystack. In their biographies and the studies that had been done of some of those important makers, Haystack was often not mentioned, or it was just a footnote, or it was one sentence. So we discovered pretty early that our research was going to be almost entirely from the ground up. And we were going to be the first people to tell the story of Haystack's founding and history from a really researched and scholarly perspective. This was exciting, but also incredibly daunting. So 3 major resources guided our project. Haystack has a very substantial, well-organized, and publicly accessible paper archive that had been placed coincidentally after we decided to round out our show at 69. It turned out that in right around 1970-71, Haystack's first 20 years of paper archive had been placed at the University of Maine. They were available by microfilm. They are substantial, tons and tons of paper documents, scrapbooks, correspondence, pamphlets, clippings, all kinds of stuff. A really, really rich paper archive. We also found at the school's campus more paper archives, valuable, important paper archives, complete sets of all the school's brochures from all those early years, as well as all the board meeting minutes, which were fascinating to read, and I mean that sincerely. I really, really enjoyed reading those board meeting minutes. But also tons and tons of slides, a really extraordinary amount of visual material. This is mid-century. Everybody was taking Kodachrome slides. This was how the director of the school, Fran Merritt, traveled around the country all winter promoting the school with slide carousels, slideshows. So Diana and I came upon, on our very first visit to the campus, and Paul generously was like, go ahead, go look at whatever you want over there. And we really took that to heart and dug through boxes. We uncovered probably thousands of slides and photographs. Again, really overwhelming. What were we going to do with these? How were they going to inform our research? How were we even going to get access to equipment to look at them? But we culled a huge batch. We took them back to the Portland Museum of Art. Diana had tons scanned. We organized a really special day early in the research where we probably put together 9 or 10 carousels and sat with Paul and Ginger, the former director, Stu Kestenbaum, as well as Al Merritt, who was the son of the first director, and his wife, Nancy, who'd been a student at the new Deer Isle campus in '61. So Al and Nancy sat with us, and they in particular, as we just ran through these slides, sort of not knowing anything about them, over and over again, they were able to say, that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, and I remember Kite Day, and oh, that's a pot by so-and-so, identifying objects, people, and really those slides also helped give us a sense of the kind of ephemeral social activities, the community, and how people spent their time. Of course we know they were in the clay studio or the weaving studio, but what was that experience like, that more ephemeral quality of how people spent time and lived in those communities, in that community? That was a really special day and helped us realize how much those slides were going to inform our understanding of the paper archive as well. The other thing that we started with at the very beginning was a very valuable but incomplete list of instructors who taught at Haystack in the 50s and 60s. And we realized that many of those people who had taught at Haystack were still alive, and we sought opportunities to interview as many of them as possible. What you're seeing on the left is the list of all the artists who were at Haystack in the 50s and 60s who we interviewed. That's our interview list. We corresponded by paper. Not everyone in their 80s and 90s was using email, so we used email, we used phone, we used paper correspondence, and as much as possible, we interviewed people in person. The first interview we did was with Estelle Chevis, who you see in this slide in the black t-shirt. She's with textiles stitchery instructor Mariska Karas. There's a beautiful work by Mariska Karas in the show. Estelle Chevis was the last living founder of Haystack when we started the project. And again, that first interview we did, which happened to be with her, again, set the course for our research of how valuable those firsthand personal stories were going to be. Those interviews, those slides, also led us to objects, and Diana can talk about that.
We were, frankly, a little nervous about pulling together a group of objects that were going to be able to tell this story, particularly because we knew that Haystack was a place that valued process, that valued experimentation, that valued artists taking risks and spending time with media that wasn't necessarily their primary media. So we really didn't know quite what we were gonna dig up when we began the process. And we found that by going to many, many colleagues, including our colleagues at the Cranbrook Art Museum, and delving into their collections, we were able to find some really stunningly beautiful works of art that were either made at Haystack, begun at Haystack, things like Ruben Ishkanyan's fantastic tapestry called Haystack that's up in the exhibition galleries, or works that were inspired by time at Haystack. And we're pleased to say that over half of the works in the exhibition we know to have been either made on campus at Haystack or really inspired by the time that artists spent there. And for the rest of the objects in the exhibition, what you're seeing are works that are made within about 2 or 3 years of the time that an artist is at Haystack. And the other wonderful opportunity we had in discussing and interviewing with so many artists and students from that period was an ability, what we found, which I'm sure is true for any of you all who have been there, was that artists were constantly trading with one another. So, and please, all of you, keep your objects and keep the objects that you get from your friends, because invariably, when we went to see someone, they would begin by telling us that they had nothing. And by the end of an interview, things would just begin to emerge. And we have several instances upstairs of these wonderful relationships forged at Haystack. People like Cynthia Bringle, a ceramicist, and Arlene Fish, a jewelry maker. Two artists who we never would have understood or thought about together, but who forged a connection at Haystack, who traded works, and whose that trade is visible in a case upstairs. So these opportunities to talk to artists, to bring them out of permanent collections, enriched the object trove that we were able to use to help tell the story about community.
Okay, so now we're going to share just a couple of specific stories about how those archives, slides, and objects came together. From the start of our research, we knew that one of the most important people we could talk to would be Jack Lerner-Larsen, who of course is one of Cranbrook's celebrated alums, but he's also a really, really important part of Haystack's history going right back to the beginning. Larsen is a brand new Cranbrook grad establishing his New York City, Manhattan showroom and on the cusp of a really sort of celebrity career as a textile designer when in 1952 he's invited to teach weaving at Haystack, second summer that the campus is open. Larsen then taught every summer well into the mid-60s. By 55, I think he's a board member of Haystack. He continued all through the 70s, the 80s to always be coming to campus, to be teaching, to be informally present, and he remains the honorary chair of Haystack's Board of Trustees. Diana and I were incredibly fortunate to talk with Jack several times over the course of our research, and that's me on the deck at Haystack with Jack in summer 2017. That was a really special total coincidence that I got to be there on the day that Jack was visiting. Our very first interview, though, we were actually joined by Paul, which was a really kind of just, again, kind of fortunate coincidence that the timing worked out. To spend the afternoon with Jack Larsen in his Manhattan apartment. And we had a really, really wonderful afternoon, all of us asking questions, but really listening, because Jack was just, stories were pouring out of him about Haystack's earliest years. It was really clear that Larsen was not only an influential teacher and board member at Haystack, but because of his extensive ties to the craft community and the art world in general, and also because of Jack's really dynamic personality, he was also instrumental in bringing a whole array of artists to Haystack, both as instructors and also as gifted students. So the thing that struck us, as Diana said, we were looking for objects. And of course we knew we wanted something by Jack in the show, but the thing that we remembered that was so special about that interview, he casually mentions that he had invented one of his best-known upholstery fabrics, remoulade, at Haystack in the early 50s from the leftover yarns and threads and bobbins that he'd found in the weaving studio. So remoulade became one of his most successful, commercially successful textile designs, and we were very fortunate not only to include in the exhibition a beautiful example of the industrially manufactured version, which is the yellow that you see on the left, but we also came across in a museum collection a hand weave, which, you know, we thought there were no hand weaves left of remoulade. Jack wasn't quite sure where they were, and lo and behold, we came across a beautiful hand weave. So this may or may not be the actual hand weave of remoulade that he created at Haystack, but it's certainly one of the very early examples of this important sample of Jack's work. All right, one more story from the 50s. This is a lovely coincidence of sort of three different intersections. Renowned fiber artist Komachi was also another name that came onto our radar pretty early in the research, and she hadn't been an instructor, but we came across her name through some other sources, and she'd come to Haystack. It turned out she'd come to Haystack as a student in 1956, and she had come to study with Jack Lerner-Larsen. On your right is a work of art she made in Larsen's textile summer in the summer of 56. So again, when Diana says, please save your stuff, Komachi saved her stuff. She had all her weaving samples from the summer of 56 in Larsen's studio at Haystack. What you're also seeing, though, are two different photographs from Jack Larson's critique of the assignment that Kay made this for on the deck at the old Haystack campus. Diana went out to Berkeley, interviewed Kay Komachi, and in the course of the conversation, not only did Kay reveal all these beautiful little weaving samples and these two substantial ones, she has both emotional and intellectual stripes. That was the assignment. We borrowed emotional stripes for the show. But she also said, oh, I have all these beautiful little black and white photographs from that summer. We learned that Karen Carnes and David Weinrib had been there that summer, and we're able to confirm that Karen had been there, not just David. But Kay had this beautiful black and white photograph of Jack Leonard Larson leading the critique of that assignment. Meanwhile, on our first visit to the campus in summer of 2015, we'd been made aware of a 1956 student named Walter Holt who'd been there and who had just coincidentally that summer handed over all his photos from summer of '56 to Haystack. And so Paul and Ginger kind of just gave us access to them, and we didn't really think, we didn't know what to do with them at that point. But after Diana talked to Kay Komachi about the summer of '56, we went back to Walter Holt's photographs, and sure enough, there was Walter's beautiful color photo of the exact same weaving assignment. And I was able to go to Philadelphia and interview Walter, who had memories of meeting Kay Komachi. So again, sort of putting these different pieces all together and getting an object and these different perspectives and different student memories of that moment in time was really, really special. Again, made possible by this convergence of different archive components.
So I'm going to now tell you a little bit about one of the odder objects in our collection upstairs in the exhibition, our finger cups and bowls, and the story of when funk ceramics came to Haystack in 1967. We became aware through this original list of instructors that we had that Robert Arneson had been on campus in 1967, and through talking to his widow, Sandra Shannonhouse, we were able to be in touch with two students who had been there with him over that summer, one of whom was Vern Funk. He's Vern Funk in the funk movement, which was exceedingly confusing and continues to be, quite frankly. But he likes it. That's right. As well as Victor Sikansky, who is a Canadian ceramicist, who both as young folks came to Haystack for the entire summer for ceramics in 1967. And to just give you a brief aside, a sense of just how Catholic Fran Merritt was in his approach to different media. Arneson showed up directly after Warren McKenzie, who, for those of you who know, could probably not be, he's about the furthest from Bob Arneson that you could possibly be. So a meticulous maker, soft-spoken, very quiet, about fundamentals, invested in the Mingei Japanese ceramic tradition. And Bob showed up and by all accounts was bombastic and loud and messy, and was fresh off of the funk exhibition at the Berkeley Art Museum, curated by Peter Seltz, which was a celebration of everything anti-establishment and deliberately ugly and in your face. And so that exhibition had actually traveled to Boston the summer of 1967. So we have this wonderful group, again, of slides that Vern Funk provided us with. He took the class to the exhibition at the ICA in Boston in '67. So you see a picture up here of Vern Funk wearing his funk buttons, asleep on the way back from Boston, heading back up to Maine. And you also see these wonderful memories, or objects that came through that summer. So this is a work that Robert Arneson made, a portrait of Vern. He actually spells Vern's name wrong. There's an extra E on the other side of this. But this lovely kind of portrait in clay that Arneson does of Vern. And then a work by Sikansky, clearly inspired by the time that he spends with Arneson at Haystack. The other thing that we were able to establish was in 1960s, when the Berkeley Art Museum had shown the funk exhibition, one of the key objects in that show had been Robert Arneson's typewriter. And as you can see, it's a typewriter that rather than having keys, it has these terrifying fingers that are emerging from the keypad, kind of menacing towards you. The fingernails are actually painted with actual red nail polish. So when we opened in Portland, Rachel and I both had bright red nails in homage. But we knew also from the hearsay around this typewriter that in a fit of exuberance, Arneson had promised it to the Berkeley Art Museum at the opening of that show, either conveniently not knowing or forgetting that in fact it had already been promised to a private collector. So Arneson and his dealer were in a bit of a bind when the Berkeley Art Show closed. Arneson's next stop was Haystack, where he hastily created a second version of the typewriter. And we were able to confirm this, again, through Funk's wonderful slide collection, which established, because those wood slats are totally unmistakable, that in fact Arneson was at work at a second version of the typewriter that summer at Haystack, so that both the Berkeley Art Museum and the private collector could be satisfied. The other thing that we know is that Arneson went a little finger crazy that summer, and that he'd brought his mold up, and so his students talk about the fact that he was essentially affixing these fingers to everything he could produce and get his hands on, including these wonderful suite of cups and bowls with these fingers emerging at kind of crazy angles. And the other, the wonderful way in which we were able to bring them into the exhibition was another one of these serendipitous relationships established at Haystack between the funk ceramicist from California, Robert Arneson, and the weaver Olga de Amaral, who hails from Bogota, Colombia. So the two of them struck up a friendship at Haystack, and we, in talking to Olga, not related whatsoever to Arneson, just talking to her about her time at Haystack, about relationships that she'd made, she happened to mention that they had become friends and they had made a trade. Unfortunately, the textile that Olga made didn't survive. It ended up in a fire at Arneson's studio, but this wonderful and weird set of cups and bowls was still with Olga de Amaral. So we were able to borrow, and Olga very, very wonderfully donated the group to the PMA. So it becomes this, again, this wonderful way of talking about that particular moment, but also talking about this kind of totally unlikely relationship forged at Haystack.
Okay, so the painters Wolf Kahn and Emily Mason became a really unexpected and important part of Haystack's story, and they also really helped enrich our sense of Haystack as a place that defied traditional notions and definitions of craft in both decades. And just as an aside, we put up that long list of all of our interview subjects. And not surprisingly, we had missed our chance to interview many of the artists who had been at Haystack in those early years because they'd already passed away. During the course of our research, quite a few wonderful artists that we did interview passed away. And most poignantly, just this week, Emily Mason passed away on Tuesday. So we were really sorry to hear of her loss. But she shared wonderful stories, and it was a real privilege to spend several times visiting her studio and talking with both her and Wolf. So this is how we got to Emily and Wolf. We knew Wolf was on that faculty list, so we knew Wolf had been an instructor in 1962. So Diana and I go down to Chelsea. He has an opening at his gallery, and we're trying to talk to Wolf Kahn. And he's mobbed by people, and the dealer kind of helpfully says, well, maybe you should talk to his wife. She was an important American abstract painter as well, and maybe she could help us set up a chance to talk to Wolf about Haystack. So when we introduce ourselves to Emily and tell her about how we're doing this research on Haystack, she said, well, I was Haystack's first scholarship student in '52. I could tell you some things about Haystack. And it was this most wonderful, serendipitous, extraordinary two-for-one opportunity to get Emily's insights and memories about Haystack in the 50s, really from its earliest moment, and then to hear Wolf talk about what it was like to be there in the 60s. Again, Diana and I did several interviews with both of them, but Emily in particular, and her stories really helped us understand how loose and open Haystack's curriculum was from the very beginning. She was there as a young painter. She was there as a young painter, but she's in the wood shop, she's in the fiber studio. She talked about doing lots of different kinds of things at Haystack, and we found this beautiful, sweet little newspaper clipping. There's Emily turning something on the lathe with woodworker Jake May. But also, really importantly, she was captivated by a lecture on color theory by Jack Leonard Larson, where he talked about the idea of analogous color using skeins of yarn. And she told us that story multiple times. It was really an important story, and it's published in her stories in publications about Emily Mason. It is a particular story that she's put out into the world, how important this moment was as a way in which this moment at a craft school with the use of yarn informed this lifelong commitment to a career as an abstract painter of color. Wolf Kahn, on the other hand, Emily maintained a friendship with Fran and Priscilla Merritt through the 50s, and in 1962, through that friendship, Wolf gets invited to teach painting at Haystack in 62. Wolf shared stories about what it meant to teach painting at a craft school, and how he had been part of a sort of contentious roundtable debate with a bunch of other painters, New York school painters who were at Haystack, that Fran Merritt had purposely gathered specifically to trouble that hierarchy between art and craft. Fran was bringing those conversations right to Haystack. He wasn't afraid of them. He was interested in messing up people's assumptions and ideas about how things needed to be separated or categorized. Emily and Wolf were definitely another moment in our research where one tiny little bit of information just opened up a whole world of not only stories and information about Haystack's history, but two beautiful objects. Emily and Mason were actively painting and making art in 62 while they spent the summer in Deer Isle as Wolf was teaching, and they each lent these paintings out of their studios to the exhibition. So you'll see those on view upstairs as well.
So we'll tell you one last story about glass at Haystack in the 60s and another one of these serendipitous research discoveries. We knew going into this exhibition that Haystack had been an early space for experimentation in the American studio glass movement. We knew that Harvey Littleton in 1964 had begun the first provisional studio on essentially a dirt pit behind the ceramic studio at Haystack. And we were able to talk to wonderful folks in the studio glass movement, folks like Dick Marquis and Sam Herman and Michael Boylan, who really helped us flesh out the story of just how kind of wildly experimental it was, and what a kind of wild ride it was to be there at Haystack as this, both this studio itself and the space was getting established at Haystack, but very much too as the medium itself was kind of gaining traction here in the United States. So we have a wonderful suite upstairs of these really kind of goofy provisional objects that give you a sense of the fact that there was so much play and experimentation happening at Haystack at that moment. So you see here a work by Marvin Lepofsky from 1967, and he's inscribed at Haystack on the bottom. And I was able to go out to Berkeley again to see Marvin Lepofsky's studio. He unfortunately had passed away very shortly before we started our research, but he has a wonderful archivist, Jeanette Brockauer, who had thought ahead for the time that I was gonna be there and had brought out a couple of wonderful paper archives that really helped enrich our story. So one of them was a group of two prints that you'll see upstairs of an instance where in 67, Lepofsky had perhaps gotten a little bored with glass and had essentially wandered and stuck himself down in the graphics studio for a time and had done this wonderful politically themed print called End All War Peace, and that came out of the archives because it was marked Haystack, and Jeanette understood that this was a story about a maker who was kind of transgressing his typical kind of comfort zone and experimenting a little bit during his time at Haystack. The other sort of wacky object that I encourage you all to take a close look at when you're upstairs is this Francisco Reinders print. Over here, which also is called Haystack, which is why Jeanette pulled it for us originally. Reinders was a Dutch mime, and in a wonderfully Haystack 60s way had shown up to do a course on art and movement, but he too got excited about spending some time in the graphics studio, and he put together this Hieronymus Bosch-esque print that in one hand kind of we dismissed as silly and a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think in another wonderful way also actually gives you this terrific sense of the energy, the debauched sort of environment that the folks at Haystack were actually living with in the 60s in a great way. So you'll see here too, it becomes a kind of really interesting document to unpack a little bit. So you have, over here you have the printmakers pulling an enormous print. You have the, there's a loom back here, you have the fiber artists, you have the ceramicists over here, and you have the glass blowers. He's blowing an orb around himself here at the front. And this, too, was an instance of a trade. So Reinders and Lepofsky were together at Haystack in the 60s, which is why this print then comes down subsequently through Lepofsky's archive, and we were able to have it as kind of an anchor point to really think through some of the real kind of experience and environment at Haystack at that moment. And with that, I would love to turn it over. Paul's gonna, I think, talk to us a little bit about the experience of working on the exhibition with us and new things happening at Haystack now.
How's this sound? Okay. Well, if I could be as bold as say, I think we should give you a round of applause for what you've put together. And yeah, Haystack is very much alive and well. It employs me on a daily basis now. And when I could listen to this story, as I have a lot over the past year, as we've taken it on the road a bit, but also for the past really 4 years as this show has been worked on in depth. It's been such an extraordinary opportunity, both personally for me as the director of this organization, and also just for me personally in thinking about what this means in a larger perspective of a field that I care so deeply about. And when I first arrived at Haystack, it was literally like my kind of like first week on the job, right? And you show up somewhere, and the truth is, you really don't know where you are. I moved my family across the country. We, kind of land, and I walk in, and a few things happen, and then I get this phone call and says there are these 2 women, and they're coming up to Deer Isle next week, and they're working on this exhibition about Haystack. And I thought, like, well, of course they are. Like, I can't even figure out where to go tomorrow, and now there's this project. And it was really remarkable. And after a very short amount of time, I thought, well, I guess all new executive directors get 2 curators who come with a job, who start to tell your story. And it was such an amazing experience because truly, as I was understanding the moment that we currently occupied of today, or then, a few years ago at the school, there are these 2 people that are talking about and discovering the history of the founding years. And I think that opportunity was such an unusual one. And Haystacks only had 4 executive directors in the history of the school. Like all of the leadership, I'm the 4th person. And so people have stayed for very long amounts of time, almost 25, 27 years in the case of 2 people, my predecessor, and then the founding director, and then one other person who was there for 10 years, often referred to as the short period of time in Haystack. And now myself. So it's a history that really has originated from a first-person narrative, right? There are people who knew the founders. There's people who had the objects that were made in the studios, et cetera. And this is a moment where there's been so much transition in the field, and the research that Rachael and Diana did, it was like really happening in real time. They would say, we're gonna go talk to this person, and they would talk to them, and then within a few months, this person would pass away. Their life had come to an end, or there were other people they hoped to talk to, and they didn't quite make it in time. And then these conversations with Jack Larson, which were so extraordinary. And it's true, Jack did speak to us, but Jack held court, if you know Jack Larson. And he told with great pride his engagement with the school. And Jack now at almost 93 years old, he's had the longest continuous history of any one person in the history of Haystack, right? So from 1952 until now, he's been involved in a whole host of ways, down to letters that I receive every month from him, these handwritten notes about his observations of what we're doing and what's happening and what we should perhaps think about a little bit differently, and the things he loves as well. And so I think as an organization, this show it's been pivotal. And the research, I've said many times, like, we'll be eternally grateful for this exhibition. And yet I'm also concerned in a way of how we think about it, because I think the work that's upstairs isn't, in some ways, that's not really the point. Like, the work upstairs in the galleries is a stand-in. It's a placeholder for a thing that happened by an individual through an experience in a very specific place at a very specific time. And so divorced from an understanding of that history and removed out of a context, it could become any other object in some ways. And so I think what is so critical is the way in which the story of the founding of the school, this grand experiment that in some ways I don't know if anyone ever thought was going to last, or if there was even concern about that. If we started a school today, I love to think how we would do it. I would pick 5 people, and we would do feasibility studies, we would have speculative boards, we would do assessments of peer organizations. It would be painful, right? And it would go on for years until we decided we were gonna do it. We'd seek seed funding, right? This idea would just go on because you would have to be responsible in the way we would do things today. And Haystack, it was as if it just happened. And what I've thought about a lot, and what we've talked a lot about internally in the organization, both as staff and as a board, but also, as importantly, the people who have been to Haystack in the past and those who come new each year in the past few years, is that I hope we never lose the remembrance that this was and came out of and should always be an experimental community, and that this is a form of education that is radical. It's a form of education that is, to a certain degree, unprecedented. It's part of a number of others, but it's highly unusual, right? There's no permanent faculty, there's no permanent students, no degrees are granted. There's a place for people who have no formal training or education. There's a place for people who are deeply embedded in a field, and somehow all of that can exist together in the space of this school that's housed in this remarkable location, which is here. And so, to finish that thought, I hope that we never forget that's where we came from. And I think if we do forget it, and if we do lose track of the origin of what made this place so special, I think we risk losing the mission. And so what this exhibition has done, and what the research has done, and what these two human beings have done, is to put it front and center for us. And it's been a profound experience, I think, for everyone involved at Haystack. And as I've said, past, present, and I hope future. And so a couple other moments that I just wanted to frame briefly was that we've talked about that when the campus moved, and when Edward Larrabee Barnes was brought in as the architect, and of course, like everything in the history of this organization and many others, there's a story there, right? But Ed Barnes was the architect of record and built the project. Within a few years, this campus and the building project that he would do for Haystack was very quickly celebrated and recognized. And over time, it's become perhaps one of his most significant architectural projects. And so Haystack will go on to have two significant awards architecturally. We received the 25-year award from the American Institute of Architects, and so Haystack is one of only 49 buildings on this list. It's awarded roughly every year. They actually didn't award it in 2018, or 19, rather. They didn't award it. But there's 49 buildings on the list, and it's the only buildings of Barnes that's on this list. And the award is for buildings that have retained their design integrity 25 years after being built, and also buildings that have made an important contribution to culture and society. And so that's a huge legacy to carry, right? We take it very seriously. And then the site was then put on the National Register of Historic Places in 2006. The AIA list was in '94. And so, now as we look back, and if we think more about serendipity, this show and the run of the show wraps up literally as the school enters its 70th year, which is, I think, a really interesting coincidence, right? Beautifully timed, I'm sure, but it was a bit of an accident, right, that happened to coincide. And so the school is entering its 70th year, and we're thriving, right? The school's never had the success we're currently having. And I'm pleased to also share that we just recently announced the largest gift in the history of the school, which came in just a few weeks ago, and Haystack was awarded a $4 million endowment to preserve the campus in perpetuity and to help maintain it for futures moving forward. And so as we think about our work now, and as we think about the origins, and as we mentioned Emily Mason being the first scholarship student, we're now looking at, within the next year, closing a number of other endowed scholarship funds, such that our endowment will hold roughly 96 scholarship funds. We support over 27% of the students coming to the school are fully funded. And also, while this exhibition has been going on, and while we've been thinking so much about the history of the school, the board and staff are engaged in the most comprehensive strategic plan we've ever undertaken. And so we're in a moment now looking back and then also looking forward to ask, what would a place like this, how does it continue? And perhaps one of the most kind of pertinent things that have come out of this period of deep thinking we've been doing, and it is not a new concept for the school, but is really a very firm commitment, is that there is no interest in Haystack getting larger. And we really believe this is the right size for the institution. And so we can house 94 people. We can hold 104 bodies at a time. That's like maximum capacity on the campus. And I think for an organization, it's kind of a radical statement to say we don't want to be larger, but we want to grow, right? And so that means that scale doesn't have to be the same thing as growth, and that we can also think about development without thinking about expansion. And so I think as the person in the leadership role for the school, these have been the questions that have kind of underscored it the whole time of what does it mean to be the right scale? What does it mean to be responsible to an architectural legacy? What does it mean to be the stewards of this incredibly delicate coastal landscape in a time of quickly developing climate change? And what does it mean to think about preserving access and ways in which people reach the school? And so all of these things together have just been potent ways of thinking about it. And then I guess in closing, I would say too that having the show at Cranbrook has been such a special bookend to this, both from our most obvious connection of how we celebrate Jack Larson as an organization of being our honorary chair of our board, to Fran Merritt as the founding director coming from the Flint Institute of Art, but also taught here on the Cranbrook campus. There's a reason why I said that. And then Bill Brown, a man named Bill Brown, comes from Cranbrook to Haystack to be the first assistant director at Haystack in the 60s, early 60s, yeah? Leaves in the 60s to go to Penland to then become the second director at Penland. So there are all these connections, and there's many, many more that can be listed. And so I think that the influence of Cranbrook as an institution on the work that Haystack has done has been pivotal. So it's a beautiful full circle to be here. And it continues. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to take a few questions if folks have them.